Test.
Test one, two. Test one, two. Test. You can hear me like good? All right. Volume's okay? Okay, cool.
I remember last time when we did it, we were
Like test.
Why is my video inverted?
Is there anything else you need from me before I head to my meeting, or do you think we're all set?
I don't think so. I think we're good.
Yeah, like I said, I'll log in at like 10 minutes out.
Yeah, as long as he makes me host, then I will make it so.
I'll write my number here too, just in case like he doesn't. like
Yeah, that'd be
back or
good.
whatever, Then we can start attacking him.
Yeah, I should have your phone number anyway, so I'll save it. I'll send you a text.
Okay.
You get mine.
It's good. They have Sean's, but yeah, if we. Like I said, once he gets you as host, it should be all set.
And I'm sorry, it's Jack, right?
Yeah, yeah. So. But like I said, if anything emergent happens, then
It's
just
at
give me.
894.
894-85. Yeah, it should be.
It's like 89U.
It's good.
5, 7, 9. All right, so keep a text.
Perfect. Like I said, anything goes wrong, just give me a shout or. Like I said, if it gets to 10 minutes of and stuff starts going wrong, I'll be on the Zoom. So, but. Like I said, I'll over Zoom, I'll do 5 minutes before and then I'll do the. The start intro, so. Everything else is all set, so. Thank you again for being here, I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
Makes it easier, cause like I said, I know nothing about Zoom or any of this stuff, so.
Yeah.
Something there.
Hey, what's going on, guys?
Here.
All right, hold on a second. My fingers aren't quite working yet.
Thanks, Jack. Hi, Eric.
Hello. All right, so to find you guys, I'm going to make you guys host.
Okie doke.
All right, and then recording's ongoing. I don't know if you want to pause it and then start it back up. I mean, otherwise I can just edit it off. when the time comes. But
It's fine. Oh, so on the video files that just in a separate note, other than today in general, the video files that you sent me that were edited, they did have, I'm not sure what you're using to edit them, but they do have a down compression on them. So the video quality is actually better in the originals. So I went ahead and I just used the original video files and I cropped those instead. Just to save yourself some time. If you just give me the originals, then I'll just know that I need to like go in and crop around it and I can take care of that for you. Easy peasy.
well, I'm also cropping it down so when they go up on the website, they don't eat up a ton of space on our end either. So
Yeah, well, that's fair. But yeah, just know that I'm gonna
yeah, no, that's fine.
for my purpose, I'm gonna use the original and then I'm just gonna go ahead and like crop it myself. And I have a little title slide that I'm using for the TV channel now when I upload those. So yeah.
All right.
All right, and it says, are we recording right now?
Can anyone hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Thank you so much. And I was just asked when I signed in, my email address is somewhat arcane, and a nice lady was asking if anybody had signed in under my username. But I am Martin Lobkowitz, and I've been a member since 1980. And so I'm just trying to participate in the meeting. That's all.
All right. Can you view us? Can you hear everything?
Now I can hear you, and I have the chairs set up in the meeting room, and I see Colin and I see Dave, and that's all I'm trying to do. I just wanted to be able to enjoy the meeting. That's all.
Yeah, no worries. It was asking me to allow you to share your screen,
Yes.
which is probably not something that you want to do anyway.
No, I'll share my screen. I don't give a darn.
Oh, well, no, we only need the presenter to share his screen because that shows you everything that's on your laptop.
Oh, too
Yeah,
bad.
so I think that's
already did it
something
'cause
that
I
you
trust guys.
weren't looking for.
I've been a member for almost 50 years. I figured I can share my screen with you guys.
Sure. As long as you can see us and you're good.
Yes, and I see Brandon and Colin and Dave and Daniel, and Alan's computer hasn't come up yet, and everything looks very tidy in the meeting room.
Good. We like tidy.
I'm a New Englander, lived in Maine for 7 years, joined the 470 in 1980 with Mr. Batchelder, who is no longer with us, but I've been down here, and this keeps me closer to home because my whole family is in New England.
And where are you?
I'm in Boynton Beach, Florida, but my wife finally agreed after 10 years of begging. She's agreed that we're going to move back to New Hampshire.
What part of New Hampshire?
Southern New Hampshire, because we have grandchildren now. Good Lord, how old am I? We have grandchildren, and all of our families are there. The only people in Florida are my wife, me, and our blind dog, who's 12 years old. That's it. That's it. So we're going to move, but we're not going to move till winter is done. Hello, Eric Barnes. I see your name on the newsletters for years and years and years. So, and I think I've muted him or something. I don't know. I can't hear him.
He may have himself muted.
Oh, he's probably. Yeah, my audio's on.
All right, guys, my apologies for not being in person tonight, but just gonna give everybody, we're kind of a little under 5-minute warning, so we'll give everybody a 3-minute warning. Now's the time, get comfortable, maybe grab yourself a drink. And anybody that might have their microphone on still, if we could just get that muted, so when the presentation gets on the way, we won't have any interruptions. And like we always do, we'll leave room at the end for people to ask questions or yeah. So like I said, grab yourself a drink, get comfortable, and check those mics, make sure they're muted, and we'll get on the way very shortly.
Very bitter pill to swallow for the Israelis who are elated and believe in what ways is here you have giving him a lopsided deal where Palestinians get hundreds of terrorists back, live terrorists, and the Israelis get back dozens of hostages. That's tough. Yeah, I pointed out 2011 hostage prisoners, which one was that symbol the head of Hamas who has been doing since really just. We also can't discount the pressure that Netanyahu was under at home domestically. Something like 60 Israelis want this deal cut, particularly the Israeli left, and Netanyahu is facing tremendous pressure back at home. All right, so tonight we're going to address the Oval Office, play with Grant's Joe Biden's Irish goodbye. Biden's Joe traffic in the background of the presidency is one of the final visuals of his time in office tonight. Amtrak Joe's Grant Joe, P. Joe, just plain Joe. We've gotten started as a county councilman in the Senate for the presidency after seeking it 4 times. We'll have to learn how to say a word that seems contra-constitutional to him goodbye. For a man who never knew when to say this is the story. CNN has this poll out, even worse, Francesca at 36%, disagree 64% as he leaves. We say goodbye a couple of times. It's a very not say goodbye. But tonight respect him, the White House has a positive vision, I guess, for this like that. Take another victory lap, victory. My understanding is an Irish goodbye involves bouncing. Right. Disappearing. I'm not sure whether we should even the American people understand that this is a failed presidency, failed president. I guess he wants to put his final spin on it and ask for it, but the clock is ticking to January 20th. This week with Rick Hume, it's a great tease for the speech here on Fox tonight. Thank you very much, I appreciate it. Tomorrow, especially for the latest on the transition California. That's mentioned. The President's farewell address will begin at 8.
All right, everybody, I got 7 o'clock on the dot, so we're gonna get started here. Before we begin, just a friendly reminder, please make sure you guys are muted. We're gonna stay muted throughout the meeting, so please don't unmute your mics. And like I've said, as always, at the end, we're gonna allow for 10 minutes of questions or comments. So like I said, if you guys don't mind waiting till then, that would be great. Appreciate that. And without further ado, I'm gonna introduce tonight's presenter. So Brandon has been a lifelong rail fan and model railroader since the 1960s. When at the age of 10, he was invited to be an engineer for the day, which included a cab ride aboard a passenger train in college. In college, he became part of the Maine Central family in the Waterville Yard and experienced Maine railroads from inside out. His career took him to the Midwest, California, and Mid-Atlantic until returning to Maine, where he has resided for the past almost 40 years. Tonight, he will be presenting a slideshow detailing Mid-Atlantic, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware railroading in the early to mid-1980s, with an emphasis on Conrail as well as connecting lines such as the D&H and Amtrak and a few regional short lines. So without further ado, Brandon, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for having me. I did a presentation to the 470 Club, I don't know, 2, maybe 3 years ago. And apparently I didn't offend anybody or scare anybody off. So I'm pleased you wanted to have me back. and to share some of these pictures. So I batted around a few subjects with the speaker committee, and we hit upon this one as one that seemed like it would be interesting to most members. And it is going to be a view, as you heard in the introduction, a view of Conrail during the 1980s as it was starting to transition out of being a mishmash of predecessor railroads and really kind of becoming a modern entity all on of its own, and what that looked like in some of the busier parts of Conrail, and mostly in the mid-Atlantic states. And before I do that, I thought I would just, some of this was just covered in the introduction, but just introduce myself a little bit. I know some of you, but I know most of you probably don't know me. As Jack's intro said, my rail fan pedigree dates back to when I was 10 years old in the 1960s. And it's too long a story to tell here and now, but the short version is the Long Island Railroad, where I grew up on Long Island, was in need of a public relations event some point around Christmas time, and it happened to coincide with my 10th birthday. And through the magic of public relations and media, I was invited to be an engineer for a day on a passenger train on the Long Island Railroad. They were rolling out their brand new Alco Century 420 passenger diesels at about this point, and I think that was one of the things they were trying to highlight. But the ride involved literally sitting on the engineer's lap, as you can see in the picture, blowing the whistle and tending to the brakes and the throttle a little bit under the watchful eye of not only the engineer, but the president of the railroad, who you can see in that picture there. And this was covered by the CBS Evening News by no less a journalist than Harry Reasoner himself, who rode the cab with me. So with that as a start, that kind of sparked my interest in trains that's never really left me. And after high school, I went to college at Colby, and because of that, became very familiar with the Maine Central and the management and the employees who operate the trains and everybody in between, and contributed sometimes to the Maine Central Messenger here and there with photographs and anecdotes and things that they needed for that publication. Then I moved to the Midwest for graduate school in central Indiana in '76, right at the beginning of Conrail, and witnessed some of the early days of Conrail there. Moved to California for a job after that, was there for a few years. And then I moved back to the Northeast to work in Delaware in the nuclear power industry. And that's where most of the subject material for tonight's presentation is going to come from my years spent there. And then, of course, in '84, I moved back here to Maine. I've been here ever since, reuniting with many of my Maine friends and connecting to the Maine Central as it kind of disappeared into history, unfortunately, in many ways. I miss it, but life moves on. And then, of course, I'm a model railroader too, and on my layout, I recreated a portion of the Maine Central as closely as I can to my recollection of what it was like in the 1970s. And a couple of people from the club have, in fact, participated in operating sessions on that layout. So from that, we'll dive right into the subject of tonight's talk. Most of you probably know this kind of stuff, but in case you're new to the railroads of the Northeast and how they've evolved to what they are now. Conrail was formed in April of 1976 because the Penn Central Railroad, which was itself a merger of two other railroads, the Pennsylvania and the New York Central, imploded financially for a variety of reasons. And when that happened, all the connecting railroads that depended on them for interchange and per diem revenue and things like that, which were mostly what we call the anthracite roads, the railroads that hauled a lot of coal out of eastern Pennsylvania to the East Coast and the Great Lakes, like the Lehigh Valley and the Erie, Lackawanna, the central of New Jersey and the Reading, were all smaller railroads that were all kind of active interchange partners with Conrail. I mean, with Penn Central at that point. So the fortunes of Anthracite by the 1970s had kind of dwindled as well. So those railroads were either bankrupt or just barely hanging in there, trying to repurpose themselves from hauling coal to being bridge line carriers between the Midwest and the East Coast. And that was not going great. It wasn't going terrible, but it wasn't going great either. And the Penn Central bankruptcy was enough to topple all of them as well. So all of a sudden there was this morass of bankrupt, undermaintained, threadbare railroads wobbling around throughout the entire Northeast, from Boston to Virginia and as west to St. Louis and Chicago. And Conrail was created as a solution to that. And all these railroads were blended in the Conrail. Certain lines were beefed up, other lines were abandoned, and that's what gave rise to it. The years I lived in Indiana, as I mentioned before, were what I call the transition period. And during that transition period, when you went out rail fanning, it was like anything goes. You could see freight engines hauling Amtrak trains, as you see in that upper picture on the left. There were so many locomotive failures on Conrail that they would lease everything and anything from anyone. So it wasn't unusual to see Bangor and Aroostook GP9s and GP38s as part of trains in places like Indiana and St. Louis. And then, of course, there wasn't money or time at first to repaint any of the equipment they had acquired as part of the merger. So you saw a lot of trains running around the first few years that were still pretty much in their predecessor colors, but of course all mixed up randomly on locomotive lash-ups. So it was kind of chaotic, but interesting at the same time to see that. And that was pretty much the late 70s in a nutshell on that system. It was like all kinds of crazy stuff. I have boxes and boxes of slides of lash-ups that are even nuttier than some of these ones you see here. Whoops, it went the wrong way. Whoop. There we go. Okay, so then I went on a little hiatus for my first job. I was out west for a number of years, so I was away from the Northeast. I moved back in 1981, so I had kind of taken a breather from all this Northeastern Railroad mayhem. And when I made it back to the East Coast, I was living in Delaware, not far from Wilmington, and right smack dab in the middle of the Northeast Corridor, which when I had left to go west and the beginning of Conrail, things had really changed. The Northeast Corridor had originally been the main line of the Pennsylvania and then the Penn Central Railroad. And prior to Conrail, Penn Central ran the passenger trains under contract to Amtrak and various commuter agencies. When I returned, ownership of the Northeast Corridor was completely in the hands of the Amtrak as an agency, and they dispatched, operated, maintained everything. And to the extent Conrail was a presence there, they were a tenant. They ran their freight trains along the corridor whenever Amtrak would allow them to, but they were not really an entity that anyone identified as once having run the entire system. But there were plenty of artifacts of the old Pennsylvania Railroad in this case on that line that were interesting to me, like the position light signals that you can see at the top of the photograph. The two Amtrak trains you see passing here are Metroliners, which were high-speed multiple unit trains that were supposed to be the salvation of passenger service in the Northeast when they were built in the late 60s. And they were built and operated briefly by the Pennsylvania Railroad. And shortly after that, the Penn Central merger happened within like a year or two of the creation of the Metroliners. So they became identified with the Penn Central pretty quickly and stayed that way up until the creation of Amtrak in 1971. But nonetheless, these are passenger trains that are, even though they're painted for Amtrak in a kind of a circusy paint scheme by today's standards, they were actually artifacts also from the Pennsylvania Railroad era that were still running off miles 15 years later for Amtrak. New owner, new track, but old equipment. And that became kind of what I became fascinated with as I explored this region. As you'll probably pick up in some of the remaining pictures, it was kind of like being a railfan archaeologist, looking around amongst all this contemporary railroading for pieces of the classic era of railroading that still existed, and they were fairly abundant if you knew where to look, and that kind of made things interesting. So the Northeast Corridor itself was a pretty diverse set of places. Here's a bunch of equipment that ran on it routinely at the time. This was like the boring everyday stuff that we saw that, of course, none of it exists anymore, so it's all now exotic. The upper left picture we're looking at, the Silver Star in the northbound heading for Philadelphia and New York during a winter storm in February of '82. And that's being hauled by an E60 locomotive, which was the successor to the GG1. That was the Northeast Corridor's heavy, high horsepower, bidirectional, high-speed locomotive built by General Electric. And it was kind of a failure. Many of them, even by 1981, had been relegated to secondary trains or even work train service in some cases, and they weren't really the primary power. They were being replaced by the AEM7s, which you see in the right-hand picture. AE7s were a Swedish locomotive, and they got the nickname Swedish meatballs. And they were smaller, lighter. They were kind of a European design. And mechanically, they were apparently superior in many ways to the E60s that they were replacing. And those trains were the ones that would handle the routine corridor trains that were the high-speed trains filled out with Amfleet equipment. The reason there were still E60s in service in the early '80s was because Amtrak was not yet done phasing out steam-heated passenger equipment. And so the E60s were primarily, when they were in passenger service, they had been built in the era before head-end power was a thing. So they were set up for the most part to steam heat their equipment. So any rolling stock that was on a passenger train that required steam heating, they had to put an E60 on the front of it. And the one major train that consistently ran that way was the Silver Star. So it rapidly became a favorite of mine because it ran with all the classic Bud and Pullman standard 1950s and 60s era passenger equipment that I had kind of grown up around and really liked the best. So it was always a treat to see that train came through, and it just happened to always come through during the middle of the day. So if it was a weekend, I could schedule some trackside time to always be able to catch it. So I ended up with a ton of pictures of it. So another train that was not part of the Northeast Corridor exactly, but it was part of the Mid-Atlantic rail scene was the turbo train. There were two of them. This is the Rohr turbo train. It's spelled ROHR, which is an aerospace company that actually designed and built this thing. And it ran between Grand Central Terminal and upstate New York, I believe, all the way to Buffalo. And it was an experimental train that fixed consist, sort of like a 1980s version of the Flying Yankee, if you will, except that ran with turbines instead of diesel propulsion. And it was definitely a unique looking train. It made, I think, 2 round trips a day throughout upstate New York, and it was kind of also ballyhooed for a little while as an experiment, which obviously failed because they don't exist anymore. But that was also seen as competition. You're fast enough to be competitive with airlines and kind of modernistic and sending a signal to the public that Amtrak was trying to be as progressive as they possibly could. And that was kind of their role. There were only a few of these things ever built. And then there was also, of course, work train equipment on the Northeast Corridor that when I first got there, they were phasing out the ragtag fleet of old former Penn Central RS3s that were leaking oil and spewing smoke and breaking down the road more often than not. And they ended up replacing them with a fleet of rebuilt GP7s, and everything at that era got maintenance away orange, like the train you see there in the lower right. The other thing that was cool about that Northeast Corridor too is all the overhead electric catenary and signaling and everything else was pure Pennsylvania Railroad. It hadn't changed a bit in like 50 years. So that was kind of fun to see in daily operation too. So a couple more scenes along that line of things you wouldn't see anymore. There's again the upper picture is the Silver Star northbound leaving Wilmington, Delaware, with a consist of traditional streamlined passenger cars. Lower left picture is kind of noteworthy too. That's a diesel hauled train running down through Delaware, and it's being hauled by an F40 and a couple of coaches. And what that is the Washington section of the Broadway Limited. The Broadway Limited, when it was a Pennsylvania Railroad train, and even earlier during beginning years of Amtrak, going east, it would split at Harrisburg. The main train would continue east towards Philadelphia and ultimately New York City, but the Washington section would split off and travel down a piece of the old Pennsylvania Railroad known as the Port Road, which ran alongside the Susquehanna River due south from Harrisburg until it got to Perryville, Maryland. And then at Perryville, it got on the main line and went the rest of the way to Washington, D.C. And for some reason pertaining to Conrail's policies, or maybe it was their track maintenance at the time, I'm not really sure, but Amtrak changed the Washington section of the train so it split off at Philadelphia and then went towards Washington, D.C. down almost the full length of the Northeast Corridor. So this was like the only diesel hauled passenger train that was running on under the wires. That was an Amtrak train. And so that was a little different. From a passenger's perspective, it probably added like 3 extra hours to the journey from Chicago to Washington, but that's how it was. And then on the right, again, one of the AEM7s and an Amfleet train, something that you can no longer see. AE7s, they've been retired for a while now. So up the road for me, like I mentioned earlier, one of the fun things to do as a rail fan around there was sort of be an archaeologist and look for evidence of the old stuff. And about 45 minutes away from where I lived was the Wilmington electric motor shops, as I think they were called, which is where the heavy electric motors of the Pennsylvania Railroad were mostly originally built and then subsequently maintained. And it was now an Amtrak facility by the time I got there. And of course, this was a characteristic of everywhere I've ever moved. Just as I moved there, it's right after the good stuff gets retired. So the month I moved to Delaware from the west was the same month that Amtrak retired all their GG1s. There were still some out in New Jersey on New Jersey Transit, and I'm going to cover those in a couple more slides from now. But the GG1s were like one of my favorite locomotives, and they've been around my entire life, and were built, I think, in the 1920s. So they had lasted a really long time, and they had finally gotten too worn out and too tired to go any further. And they were full of PCBs and other things too. So there were reasons to retire them that made sense. But I was nonetheless, as a rail fan, sorry I missed their last hurrah. But for years, they were stored at Wilmington at the electric motor shop. And back then, the railroads, even Amtrak, they were pretty laid back about rail fans. So you could just show up at Wilmington with a camera and talk to the security guard and tell him you're just there for some pictures, and he'd just wave you in. And you could walk up and down past rows and rows of dead GG1s like these and take all the pictures you want, climb up into the cab. You found they were all going to be scrapped for the most part, and the few did make it to museums and things, but mostly they were going to be scraps, and nobody cared if you pulled a souvenir off of one or not. It was kind of a different world than rail fanning is now. One of the GG1s, the 4935, the one in the upper left corner, was kind of like a trophy at the shops. It was the one GG1 Amtrak had restored into what we now refer to as heritage paint schemes. This was probably the first attempt at a heritage paint scheme locomotive anywhere in North America, probably. And back then we didn't have a name for it, but Amtrak had gone ahead to acknowledge, the history and beauty of these locomotives and fully restored it to Brunswick green with all the Pennsylvania striping. And for years after all the other engines were disposed of, 4935 was still sitting there right outside the shops in the parking lot. And I think it now survives too. I think it's at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania in Strasburg, if I remember right. Someone on the call here might actually know, but I think that's where it is. Anyway, I do know it's been preserved. It was one of the ones. It doesn't run anymore, but it's there. But all the other engines were, just as you can see, rusting apart, falling apart. It was a little bit sad to see, but it was at least a little bit of tangible evidence of how things were in the good old days. Commuter traffic too was also a nice place where you could, at that date, still see vintage rail equipment in everyday service. The upper two pictures are Pennsylvania Railroad MP54 electric MU cars that date back to at least the 1930s. And they were still in daily service for SEPTA, which was the agency that took over commuter service from Penn Central about the same time that Conrail was formed and all that stuff happened. And SEPTA had this kind of circusy paint scheme that they painted their equipment in those colors. But nonetheless, you could still see, as you see on the right, if you searched around hard enough, you could still find everyday rolling stock in service that was still lettered for the Pennsylvania Railroad that SEPTA had never gotten around to repainting. The green one that's in the middle of that consist you see over there on the right, that's one that was managed to make it as far as Penn Central colors before things changed owners. So that was pretty cool. And then on the lower left, we're looking at some New Jersey Transit equipment, which started out, these were Lackawanna MU cars built mostly around 1918 through the early 1920s. And this picture was taken in 1983. So these cars were a good 60 years old and still in daily service, but they look like they were, from a totally another era. And they were still hauling commuters every single day under New Jersey Transit's banner, even though they had been built for the Lackawanna and then became the property later of the Erie Lackawanna before the mergers all happened. And many of those cars, stripped of their pantographs, are still in service as excursion train equipment on various railroads around the Northeast. So you can still ride behind a number of them. If you ever visit the Reading and Northern Railroad in Pennsylvania and ride behind their restored Reading locomotive, you'll be riding in some of these equipment. And I think Maine Coast here in Maine even had a few of those for a while when they were running tourist service back in the 90s. And there's still many, many others that have been rebuilt into various types of equipment and all over the place. Then if you went over to the Hudson River, you could still see former New Haven FL9s running in daily commuter service and hauling a whole potpourri of long distance passenger cars that the MTA had acquired from various discontinued long distance trains. Some of them are ex-Amtrak, some of them are stuff they bought directly from railroads and refurbished and put into service. And those trains look just like classic 1950s streamliners. So that was always a treat to go over there and see that stuff running along the Hudson River. So another commuter line that has to be spoken about in this same light is New Jersey Transit. And I want to just dwell on one aspect of them a little bit that really fascinated me. It was clear from the first time I witnessed New Jersey Transit that era, the management of New Jersey Transit was mostly populated by people who had once worked in the passenger departments of railroads like the Pennsylvania and the Central of New Jersey and the Erie Lackawanna. And they still had a lot of pride in what they were doing, even if most of the equipment they were forced to work with was kind of outdated and poorly maintained. They really, really wanted to try. They were kind of, I would say, closet rail fans. So one evidence of that is the North Jersey coastline, which splits off from the Pennsylvania main line just south of Newark, New Jersey, and runs along the coastal New Jersey beach towns down to Bay Head, New Jersey, which is the termination of that particular commuter line. It's still a very busy line even today, but back then it was a very interesting operation. From South Amboy, where these pictures are taken, all the way to Bay Head, it was diesel operated. This is where the catenary ended. And even though there were MU cars that would take you directly to South Amboy, the real show here was in the morning with the commuter trains. The commuter trains all ran with 2 and 3 unit sets of rebuilt E8s. And they were in various paint schemes, only a couple of which you see here. But they all sort of had a 1950s streamliner vibe to the painting pattern, and kind of nice. And then the passenger cars were sort of like the ones up you saw in the Hudson River picture there. They were a whole potpourri of former Pennsylvania, New York Central, Seaboard Coastline, Southern Pacific, you name it, rebuilt stainless steel passenger equipment. There was even a couple of parlor cars on some of the trains. And anyway, the trains would come into South Amboy from down at the end of the line in Bay Head, and as soon as the train braked to a stop, the E units, this is in the morning going in towards New York City, the E units would quickly uncouple, pull ahead, and the next available GG1, like you see in the second picture, there was like a little pocket track there where all the GG1s that were going to be needed for the morning rush hour would be lined up, and the next one would just back down quickly onto the train. The head end crew and the conductor would couple it up, attach the air hoses, do a brake test, and boom, they were out of town. And it was like really kind of like classic old school railroading, kind of very, even though it was just a commuter operation, it was like very kind of spit and polish and very disciplined. It was a pleasure to watch. One of the interesting things there too was there was so many switching in the morning rush hour. There was a grade crossing right at the end of the platform, right where all this locomotive changing stuff was going on. And as a result of that, there was no way you could put in an automated crossing signal system with gates that would have any meaning because the movements back and forth are so frequent. So this is, I think, the last place anywhere in the Northeast that there was an actual manually operated grade crossing operation with a gate tender whose only job was to raise and lower the gates based on whistle signals from the various locomotives. And so that was always a lot of fun to watch too, and it was always fun to talk to the gate operator and hear his stories. It was great. 4877 was originally just another boring black GG1 like the others you've seen in the pictures, but the New Jersey Transit people pulled it into the shops one day and decided they were going to put that one as well into back into its historic colors. And that one had originally been built and painted in Pennsylvania Tuscan red, and that's what they returned it to. And that engine became kind of a celebrity at the time. It was affectionately known as Big Red, and it was the last GG1 to operate in revenue service. It was retired in October of '83, I believe. My girlfriend, who's now my wife, we went up New Jersey Transit, had free rides on the last GG1 train, and it just ran back and forth on a Saturday all day between South Amboy and I think Elizabeth, New Jersey, and back and forth all day long, giving people rides. They didn't even charge anything for it. You just had a perfect train running back and forth. It was like a trip back into the 1950s. It was wonderful. So that was kind of something you never see or would even think would exist anymore, but there it was. Another thing that's changed on the Northeast Corridor is freight traffic. Back when I was living there, there was still a lot of freight traffic on the Northeast Corridor. Now it's almost the thing of the past. There is a little bit, but nothing like it was back then. Back then, there were industries, including auto assembly plants and refineries and things that were right on the Northeast Corridor that had to be served by, local freight serving them. But there was also through traffic between the major northeastern cities, between New Jersey and down into Virginia to Potomac Yard, that all had through freight service that shared the right of way with Amtrak trains. But it became increasingly more difficult during the years I was living there for that to be practical, because a lot of, again, Conrail was starting to get their act together, but they had not really had the resources to buy many new locomotives, so they were still relying on 20 and 30-year mechanically worn out locomotives, many of which had not been rebuilt or well maintained. So there were often freight train failures out on the main line, which could then snarl all the passenger traffic. And so over the years I was there, was the period when most of that traffic was moved off of the Northeast Corridor and shifted over to, well, depending on where it was going, but Oak Island, which was a former Lehigh Valley yard in New Jersey, sort of became the central freight yard, and freight traffic going west rather than going out on a Pennsy route would go out the Lehigh Valley to Allentown, which we'll talk about in a couple more slides. And then from there, it would go further west on the Reading, the former Reading, I should say, to Harrisburg, and then get on what used to be the Pennsylvania Railroad for the rest of the trip. Prior to that decision, the freight would typically, a westbound traffic would leave northern New Jersey on the Northeast Corridor trackage, make it as far as Trenton, New Jersey, and then there was something called a Trenton cutoff. At that point, freight could be diverted if it was going west over on the Trenton cutoff, which would take it over towards the Susquehanna River to a place called Safe Harbor, and where it would join the Port Road, which we talked about earlier, and go up to Harrisburg that way. So that kept historic traffic routes would have kept a lot of traffic on the Northeast Corridor, but the shift was to try and get that traffic off of the Northeast Corridor as much as possible onto alternate routes. And that was theoretically one of the things Conrail could do, because they had put together this seamless system of other random freight railroads into one system, which had alternate routes they could use like that. So that became the norm. But during the period I was there, you could still see a fair amount of freight. Like this, the picture in the upper left is a train going from Potomac Yard, going towards Potomac Yard from the Philadelphia area. So that, rather than using the inland route I was just describing through Allentown, was just taking a direct route at the time, straight down the Northeast Corridor. The train on the right is a good example of what they were trying to avoid. That is an Indian River power plant coal train, the Delmarva Power and Light train that was on the Eastern Shore, which had its own branch splitting off the Northeast Corridor. And this is an empty train coming off that branch. And if you look closely in the photograph, you'll see just ahead of the lead locomotive, there's a series of crossovers. So that train would have to go, it's entering the Northeast Corridor going against traffic. It's heading south, even though it's on a northbound track. So it has to then thread its way through all those other crossovers to get over to the right-handmost track, to continue its journey in the right direction on track that's signaled for that. So what that meant was, for about 15 or 20 minutes at some point, the Northeast Corridor had to come to a stop while this coal train slowly navigated all that switch work. And if everything went well and no engines failed or something like that, it would take 15 minutes. So that train would have to come up and wait for a lull in passenger traffic so the tower could align the interlocking switches and let them through. And then after that train would make it through, then whatever passenger traffic could start moving again. So that was the sort of conflict that moving as much traffic as they could off that line was intended to solve. There was still some traffic, and even today there's some captive traffic that still has to nonetheless run on the Northeast Corridor. There's a good-sized freight yard in Wilmington called Willsmere Yard that serves, I don't know who it serves now, but when I was there, it served all the DuPont chemical plant, which was like a whole chemical coast area in northern Delaware. And that that yard was there to serve that, and the only way that yard could be reached by road freight would be over the Northeast Corridor. So that's what you see in that lower left picture is a train that's working in the yard before continuing along. So there was, I think probably to this day, there's still some of that kind of traffic. I think for the most part, from what I've heard and read, it mostly moves at night. So what little freight there is left, other than maybe a few locals, mostly is nocturnal to avoid as many conflicts with passenger service as possible. Another thing that was always fun to do when I was trying to be a railroad archaeologist, I guess you could say, was to go down to Baltimore. Baltimore was interesting. It was dominated by the B&O and the Western Maryland, and even though the Pennsy passed through it with their 4-track main line and a whole slew of passengers, trains and stuff, it was sort of the minority road there. So I don't really have any good Conrail per se pictures of the Baltimore area, but one of the things I loved to do there was a locomotive scrapping enterprise called Striegel Supply, and they were one of the 2 major places where retired locomotives went to be cut up and recycled. And other than it being really shabby and weedy and rusty and everything like you see in this picture, there was always interesting things to see here. This was a former Pennsylvania Railroad E7. Other than the one in the museum at Strasbourg, this was the only E7 at this point left in captivity anywhere in the world. And once it was the most common passenger locomotive of all time, and they were built in the 1940s mostly, and some of them lasted up until the beginning of Amtrak, but they were all kind of getting a little tired by then, so most of them got retired at that point. Those of you who are familiar with the Maine Central may recall that the Maine Central's mainstay in their 1940s through 1960s diesel passenger service were also these E7s. So that gives you an idea how old these things were. But here was one sitting there, and you could just climb all over it and take pictures of it and pretty much do anything you want. But there was all sorts of other fun things you could find there too. There was the remains of a Fairbanks Morse road switcher just sort of lying there in pieces. There's an Amtrak E unit in the background being scrapped, an RS1 over on the lower right. And also the other thing that was interesting around there was a big Bethlehem steel plant, Sparrows Point, I believe it was called, and it was very active. And it ran with they had their own plant switching railroad, which was called the Patapsco and Back River, but it was basically the switching railroad for the purpose of serving the steel plant. And they had a big fleet of Baldwins, probably the only active Baldwins in the Northeast at that time. So there were always interesting things to discover in the nooks and crannies of Baltimore. So aside from the famous B&O Museum, so it was always fun to go down there. So the next few slides, we're going to leave behind the Northeast Corridor and sort of go up into other parts of Pennsylvania and New York that Conrail inhabited. And this first picture, we're looking at, we're in Lehighton, Pennsylvania, which is in the Lehigh River Valley. It's about, if you know your Pennsylvania geography, it's maybe 25 or 30 miles northwest of Allentown. And this was an interesting place pre-Conrail. Both the central of New Jersey and the Lehigh Valley, which were arch rivals during the Anthracite era, each railroad had a parallel competing line, one on each side of the Lehigh River, all the way between basically somewhere in New Jersey, all the way to Scranton, Pennsylvania. And the funnel for that was the Lehigh River and vicinity west of Allentown. And both of these railroads ran like just constant coal trains during that era. When the anthracite traffic died in the 60s, both the Lehigh Valley and the CNJ were kind of forced into kind of an awkward financial situation. They didn't really have a baseline of traffic anymore, and they had to kind of remodel themselves as bridge line partners with more Western railroads that didn't make it to the New York area that they could forward freight for. And they made a gallant try at doing that, but ultimately there wasn't enough traffic for two railroads to share. And the first thing that happened was to try and fix the problem was the Lehigh Valley and the C&J got together and decided they were going to abandon segments of each of the two railroads and kind of take the best parts of each of the railroads and save them and weave them together into one route and kind of dispatch it and operate it jointly. And that worked as a stopgap measure for a few more years, but then ultimately the Central of New Jersey just kind of threw in the towel and said, we're leaving Pennsylvania. There's just not enough traffic in Pennsylvania for us. And they cut back their operation to just the state of New Jersey, leaving what was left to the Lehigh Valley. And that's how that ran right up until Conrail as a Lehigh Valley, entire Lehigh Valley route. And what we're doing in this picture, and that's how Conrail kind of picked it up from that point, kind of ran it the same way for a while. And we're at a point in Lehighton where this train is exiting a section of the Central of New Jersey, which actually passes over it. It's on a kind of a ramp coming down off the Central of New Jersey. The C&J right of way would be kind of off to the left of that signal where those bushes are, up on a grade that you really can't see. So this train is coming down a ramp onto the Lehigh Valley at Lehighton, and that's Lehigh Valley's main line you see in the foreground that's about to swing onto. So this is kind of typical of things you would see on that section of the railroad. And just further towards the east is Allentown, which I've mentioned before. So Allentown was a crossroads between Central of New Jersey. The yard itself was originally owned by the Central of New Jersey until all the changes happened. But it was tenants that visited and interchanged there included the Lehigh Valley Railroad, the Lehigh and Hudson River Railroad, and the Reading. And so it was in the pre-Conrail era. This was like a really diverse place. You could see engines and freights from all those different railroads. A hump yard here, all kinds of things. And under Conrail, it was now all one seamless single owner, but most of those different routes were still pretty active as they are today. Allentown is still kind of a major hub for today's, I guess it's mostly a Norfolk Southern facility at this point, but under Conrail, it was also very, very busy too, and it still is. So in the first picture in the upper left, we're looking eastward through the throat of the yard, and all the tracks in the foreground that go off in different directions are various Reading and Lehigh Valley routes that are splintering off at that end of the yard, going to Harrisburg, going to Philadelphia, going towards Buffalo. And then in the next picture down below, with the black GP38 on it, that's a train that's swinging out of the yard and getting onto the Lehigh Valley. I think the symbol on that train was OIBU, which was Oak Island to Buffalo. So that's a train that's going to follow the entire length of the Lehigh Valley through Wilkes-Barre, Coxton, up through Waverly, New York, and onward past the Finger Lakes and ultimately go to Buffalo. The train on the upper right, now we're looking westerly out of the throat of the yard. That is a carryover from the Lehigh Valley days. That train is known as the Hazleton Man, and there was still some active coal mining up in the Hazleton, Pennsylvania area, which was on a branch that splits off of the main line of the Lehigh Valley up in the Lehigh Gorge, which is probably another 40 miles further up the railroad. And that train was interesting because it always ran with a trio of what the railroaders call pups. These are SW8s, or maybe they're SW9s. I think they're SW8s. But you can see they don't have the tapered hood that most EMD switchers have, and it's kind of boxy right where the long hood meets the cab, and that's because these engines were dynamic brake equipped, and they were specifically designed to handle the curves and the grades on that mining branch. And that train was originally Lehigh Valley, and now under Conrail was still running the same exact way, but with just new paint on the locomotives. So it's curving out of the yard going west. It's double track line, and the track in the foreground is the Reading, former Reading, heading towards Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Now that is probably the busiest east-west freight line through Pennsylvania, other than like the Pennsylvania Railroad itself. That's where most traffic between the New York, New Jersey area going west runs on that line today. It goes through Hershey, Pennsylvania, goes into Harrisburg, and then from Harrisburg it joins the former Pennsylvania Railroad main line to go the west of the way. Another train that ran up through there every day was a train that harks back to its symbol, was NE84, and going east or north. I'm not sure where each railroad had its directional thing, but going towards Maine. And it was a Portland to, it was a train that ran between Portland and Potomac Yard. And it originally started in the pre-Conrail era as a joint effort between the Boston and Maine, the Delaware and Hudson, the Lehigh Valley, which would take it as far as Allentown. At Allentown, it would switch over to that Reading track you see in the foreground. And Reading would take it to Philadelphia, and then the Baltimore and Ohio would take it to Potomac Yard. And this train was specifically intended to be competition against newly built Interstate 81, which was a north-south trucking route that runs along basically the same route in many places of the Northeast. And the railroads saw that as a threat to primarily the paper traffic coming out of Maine and all the raw materials like clay and chemicals coming up from the Southeast, and wanted to keep that business. So they put this joint train together that ran. And if you go anywhere on the internet or through railfan books you may have and see pictures from that era, you'll see all kinds of diesels from the member roads pulling that train. And when the train got to Allentown, one of the things that had to happen is it came in from the north, the way you see it here. It would pull into the yard, but then it had to leave going out the Reading track in the foreground. So the engines had to uncouple, run around their train. A switcher had to come out, take the caboose off, put a caboose on the other end of the train. Eventually, they started running this train with a caboose on either end so they could save a little bit of time on that. So then that train would continue on with Reading power the rest of the way to Philadelphia. So the Reading power rarely made it any further north than here. But the D&H and the Lehigh Valley power that would get put on here oftentimes would make it all the way to at least Mechanicville, if not all the way to Rigby in Portland. So some of you who may have seen D&H and Lehigh Valley engines in that era down at Rigby Yard in Portland, that they were assigned to this train. So under Conrail, which is the era we're in here now, that train still ran. The D&H, when Conrail was formed, it was like the only other independent railroad in the region for the most part in the mid-Atlantic. And so in order to kind of level the playing field a little bit, the government regulators required Conrail to grant very generous trackage rights for the D&H over Conrail routes, so the D&H could provide some level of competition against Conrail. And one of the train routes that got grandfathered into that agreement was the old NE84, NE87 combo. And that's what you see here arriving in Allentown. So it added a little extra spice to going to Allentown to be able to see that train. It was always a source of friction operationally, though, because Conrail regarded it as competition to their system, and the D&H trains were always at the mercy of Conrail dispatchers who were in no hurry to grant them priority routing ever. So a lot of times the trains were painfully delayed while Conrail did its thing and let the D&H sit in a siding someplace. And that's a whole other topic for a whole other presentation. Let's see what's next on here. There we go. Okay, so you may remember I mentioned earlier that freight, a lot of freight out of New York went west as far as Trenton, New Jersey, and then used what was called the Trenton Cutoff to go further west. And this is at the place at Safe Harbor where the Trenton Cutoff met the river line, the Port Road as it was known. And one of the nice things about photography here is that I'm taking these pictures from a scenic overlook park. It's adjacent to the Susquehanna River, which is kind of just off to the right in most of these pictures out of scene, next to a giant hydro dam that was called Safe Harbor Dam. And the overlook park was intended not for rail fanning, of course, but just as a picnic grounds or something that the power company put in a place you could watch bald eagles fishing in the river and things of that sort. But it also happened to make a fantastic rail fanning vantage point. So in typical Pennsylvania Railroad fashion, it's like all heavy duty steel viaducts and lots of catenary and things left over. But at this point, there was no electric freight service anymore, but all the infrastructure was still there, of course. So the train in the upper left picture is a bunch of empty auto racks probably being forwarded back to Michigan or the Midwest, coming from the greater New York area over that Trenton Cutoff. This is before they routed all that kind of freight through Allentown. And the picture on the right is I don't know what it is. It's some sort of general freight going the opposite direction. Looks like it's handling some chemicals and things like what I'm not sure what's in the hopper cars. It's not coal, probably slag or something like that, but it's going east. And then in the lower left picture, you can see that's one of those Delmarva Power and Light trains from that. Remember, you saw the picture earlier of a freight threading its way through that interlocking on the Northeast Corridor. This is a train that's leapfrogged through all of that and gone down the Northeast Corridor as far as Perryville and is now trekking its way up the Susquehanna River Valley out to western Pennsylvania to get another load of coal. And so that double track main line passed underneath the Trenton Cutoff line, and you could just sit in this park and just all day long. It was like one freight train after another. Like there were at least 2 or 3 trains an hour, all 24/7. It was just an awesome place to train watch. Since the date of these pictures, the Trenton Cutoff, which because like they said, they diverted all the freight onto other routes. Trenton Cutoff was abandoned. The bridge work is still there, but the rails have been pulled up, and it's a bike trail or something now, of course. The lower line, the Port Road, is still very active though, and this vantage point is still there. If you're ever in the area, it's still worth a visit. I don't know how busy the Port Road is anymore for freight. It's probably got a reasonable number of trains on it. Again, the thing that was cool about it at that era, besides just the trains themselves, was seeing all the overhead wires from the electric era, which had only ended like 4 or 5 years earlier. Seeing all that infrastructure there was pretty cool. So I have a few pictures here. They're sort of not really distinctive, but they are from my personal favorite, most scenic part of Conrail, which is the old Erie Main Line through upstate New York and Pennsylvania. The upper left picture, you'll just have to take my word for it, but that train is a early version of a double stack train. This is back when that was fairly novel, and that's a westbound train. The train is curving off of Storaka Viaduct, which you can't really see in the picture. I have other pictures of it coming, but that was one of about 3 or 4 trains that ran on what was called the Southern Tier route under Conrail, but it's the old Erie Main Line. There were back in that era, there were about 3 or 4 freights each way across the former Erie. Wasn't as obviously as busy as it was when it was Erie-Lackawanna, but there was this double stack train, and it ran because the Erie, as you probably know from history, was a broad gauge railroad. It was built originally to a 6-foot gauge instead of 4 feet 8.5 inches like the rest of the country, and so all their equipment was oversized on that railroad when it was originally built. And what that meant was it had very generous clearances all the way from New York to Chicago. So any bulky high-wide movements like double stacks at the time, the other routes really hadn't been re-engineered to accommodate them yet. That kind of traffic went over this line. The other traffic that ran on it is typified by what you see in the upper right picture, which is there were a lot of coal-fired power plants along the Susquehanna River in southern New York, and so they were kind of all serviced by coal trains coming out of Pennsylvania and going up into that region to serve all those different coal-fired power plants. So those trains ran sort of intermittently, but there were usually several a day, just at unpredictable times. And then there was a general freight merchandise train, which went by the symbol of ALCG, which was Allentown to Corning, New York. And it was kind of the the workhorse freight train of the line. It was always a good sized train. It always ran with older power, like you see in that lower picture, GP30 and other, 1960s era road switcher type engines. You never knew what it was going to have for power, but that train would run as well. So between all those trains, you could go up onto the Erie and see, on a good day, maybe between 4 and 8 freight trains if you timed everything right, or you could hit it on a lull and not see a darn thing and wonder why you drove all that way. But the scenery was always really nice. And I did want to touch briefly on some of the other railroads that were sort of entwined with Conrail just because of the geography and the fact that they interchanged and had to deal with them. Most prominently, probably the Delaware and Hudson, and one of my personal favorite Northeastern railroads, mostly because they ran tons of Alcos and had a very nice paint scheme. So during the same era that Conrail was finally kind of coming into its own was the same era that the Delaware and Hudson and the Maine Central and the Boston and Maine became part of Guilford. So there was some evidence of that when you'd go out and about. But basically, Binghamton, New York, became kind of the central point on the D&H. They had sort of their route after Conrail was formed changed from the historic routing, which was basically the original D&H ran from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania on their own route all the way to Montreal, and they billed themselves as the bridge line between New England and Canada, to New England and Canada. And after Conrail was formed, they got the trackage rights as far west as Buffalo and as far east as New York, the New York area, Oak Island Yard. And so they expanded their geography, even if they didn't have additional track. But they also acquired a part of the former Lackawanna main line between Scranton and Binghamton. And with that, it was a better engineered line than their original Penn Division line that kind of wound around the mountains and up and down steep grades, and probably a little bit more scenic than the other line. But operationally, it was a much better condition, even though Conrail hadn't used it for much during its first few years. And the D&H acquired that and operated on that. So they ended up with sort of a Y-shaped route. They had a trunk line that came up out of the Wilkes-Barre Scranton area to Binghamton, and then some of the traffic branched west over Conrail routes, mostly former Erie Lackawanna trackage, to get to Buffalo, which was kind of a gateway to other railroads like at the time Norfolk and Western and C&O and Canadian railroads. And the other line branched to the northeast out of Binghamton and went up to the Albany area and Mechanicville, New York, which many of you are probably familiar with. And at Mechanicville, they could either interchange to New England with the Boston and Maine or continue up north along Lake Champlain and interchange with Canadian railroads near Montreal. So that became the new configuration of the D&H going forward. And they had to acquire a variety of locomotives to keep up with all of that. And they managed to maintain a nice fleet of Alcos of their own ownership, but they also picked up a number of Conrail cast-off Alcos, like the C424 you see leading the train in the upper picture. They also, just before Conrail was formed, they had the capital. I think they got grant from the USRA at the time to acquire some new locomotives in anticipation of Conrail starting up. And some of those were General Electric U-23Bs, like you see in the lower picture, shoving a train up Belden Hill, which was like the ruling northbound grade on the railroad, which always required helpers back then. And those engines lasted for quite some time. Eventually, under Guilford, they became Maine Central locomotives in the 290 series, the 280 series. So then, during that same era, because they had acquired the Lackawanna main line, and they really didn't need the old Penn division anymore, which, by the way, went underneath Storruca Viaduct, which is what you're seeing in that upper right picture. They started using their, what had up to then been a branch into Binghamton, now became their main line out of Binghamton and went up Belden Hill and through the tunnel at the top of the grade and out the other side. And it was a real rail fan magnet in the 1980s, as you can imagine, with all these exotic locomotives. So the bottleneck with Belden Tunnel was that it was built, in the early 1900s, and it wasn't built to the dimensions of modern trains. And so they couldn't run auto racks through it, and they couldn't run stack trains through it. And so in 1985, Guilford managed to come up with funds to enlarge the Belden Hill Tunnel. And that was like about an 18-month project to rebuild the tunnel so it could accept high dimension trains. During that period, the D&H would run any trains with high dimensional cargo, and eventually all trains, while the tunnel was shut down for construction, out the old Erie to a place called Jefferson Junction, where they connected to the D&H right near the west end of this viaduct you see, go down a ramp track and connect to the D&H, and then the train would reverse directions and then continue up a little remnant of the Penn division that was left in place just to act as a bypass. And the trains, because of this complicated switching move that involved a bunch of extra road switchers and things, it was a real operational bottleneck. And you could go to the Storruca Viaduct any time of day or night, and you'd see freight train after freight train just stacked up, waiting its turn to go through this bottleneck and continue on its way. And it was just an amazing place. And the beautiful thing, right at the base of the arches there was a public park, and they allowed people to camp there. So rail fans were there every weekend, tailgating and watching all these trains go through with all kinds of incredible locomotive power. The day that Maine Central U-25B passed under, I managed to also grab a picture of a Susquehanna train. I think I have it later in the presentation, going over the top of the bridge. So I was able to get the very improbable photograph of over and under Maine Central traffic on a landmark bridge in Pennsylvania, which seemed like it was something out of a model railroad vision or something, but it actually happened on a regular basis on that line. Couple of other connecting short lines, and I'm going to close with this. The Pennsylvania main line down the eastern shore was kept by Conrail, and it was if you've looked at a railroad map of that, you've probably seen that it's kind of like almost like a tree. There's the main trunk, which runs due north-south right through Delaware into Maryland, into that little tiny tip of Virginia that's stuck onto the Delmarva Peninsula. And it was once a car ferry route. They don't use it as a car ferry route anymore, but Conrail hung on to that. But all the little branches that spun off of that and went down to these small towns where there was a lot of poultry farms. This is big territory for Frank Perdue chickens. It was like they made like factory level chicken breeding into a thing there. A lot of grain traffic as a result, and fertilizer for farms. And that was what the Maryland and Delaware served, were all those branches. And the branches were all like disconnected from each other and just tied together by the Conrail main route. So all these little branches had their own little fleet of Alcos to work on their branches. There was a kind of a Federalsburg had a shop, so you see it in the upper right hand picture, but that was like where locomotives would go if they needed services. But other than that, all these little tiny branches were like little independent railroads, all owned by one company. And it was always fascinating because everything was Alco powered, and they had everything you could think of. They had RS1s, they had that T6, which you see in the lower left picture, and they had all sorts of Alco Centuries. The one you see in the foreground in that lower right is the C420 from former Lehigh and Hudson River. The one in the distance is a former L&N, possibly even a Monon engine that they acquired. Most of these engines, believe it or not, most of these engines are still operating, but they're now operating for the Arkansas, Missouri, which, if you're familiar or seen pictures of that railroad, you probably see the very similarities in the paint scheme, because the owner of the Maryland and Delaware sold his interests about 1990 and moved all his equipment down to A&M and took that over from what had once been the Frisco and turned that into his operation. And now all the stuff on the Maryland and Delaware is still in existence, but not with this equipment and under different ownership, obviously. But most of those engines are still, maybe like the RS1 in the upper right picture. That was kind of like their hobby engine. That was like a former Washington Terminal RS1, and that engine gleamed. You went up to that engine, I think in this picture here, that's that same engine. You can see you could eat off of that thing. And that was their pride and joy, and it was like the family sports car. And they still use that apparently on passenger excursions down on the A&M in Arkansas. And I think the C420s are still in service and secondary service down there as well. I'm not totally sure about the T6, but I suspect it's around too. So these pictures are from 1981, and here it is, 2025. And some of that same equipment is still out there. So the Susquehanna, another railroad that was really cool. So this picture on the left is a stack train heading east over Storuca Viaduct. And if you look, you'll see the trailing engine is a Main Central GP38. It apparently come in as part of a Guilford lash up in the Binghamton, and then Susquehanna probably needed a spare engine for the tonnage, so they probably worked out something with the D&H to borrow it. But the Susquehanna, prior to this is a railroad that ended up thriving under the Conrail scenario. The original Susquehanna was a little kind of sleepy short line in northwestern New Jersey that had once been, part of the network of regional anthracite railroads. But after anthracite died, the old Susquehanna was kind of just left with a bunch of industrial switching on sleepy branch lines, and was probably surprisingly didn't get folded in the Conrail for some reason, but stayed out of it. And then what happened was, when Conrail was formed, other railroads like at this point, Norfolk Southern had just become a thing, right? That merger was created in 1982. And these pictures all date from like a year or two after that. The Norfolk Southern did not have access to the New York transportation market at all. So they used the Susquehanna as a surrogate to get traffic from the Midwest to and from the New York area. And the Susquehanna, in turn, had the contract to haul what were then Sealand. These are Sealand double stack trains, and these were also among the first double stacks. And once again, it had to travel over the Erie because that was the only railroad that had been built from day one with the right clearances. So Susquehanna acquired the running rights over this portion of Conrail, specifically just to haul the Sealand container traffic from one coast to the other. And as a result of that, they had to increase their fleet from a couple of rundown RS1s to, some decent road switchers, but they obviously weren't made out of money, so they had to go buy used engines, and they ended up with a fleet of mostly Alco Century 430s that were cast-offs from Conrail. The 430s were originally built for the New York Central. And so those were built in the mid-60s, and here it is, mid-80s. So these are 20-year-old engines. The GP18 you see in the lower right and in the middle engine on the Storaka Bridge Viaduct, those were Susquehanna's big locomotives from their New Jersey days. Those were road switchers they bought new in 1961 when GP18s were like the big new thing from EMD at the time. And those engines served them very well for many years and became kind of supporting road engines. Several of them still exist, and they're now working for the East Penn Railroad, which is a regional short line in southeast Pennsylvania. So Binghamton was kind of the hub of operations for the new version of the Susquehanna. The Conrail era Susquehanna was based in Binghamton. They ran this train trackage rights over the Erie and a little portion of the Lehigh and Hudson River and got down and reconnected to the original Susquehanna in Northwest New Jersey, which still existed and still exists today. And then they would run that down to a container site where the containers would be offloaded. So they were kind of tiptoeing across Conrail on this scene. The other thing that they did at the time, though, is they also acquired straight out ownership of the former Lackawanna branches out of Binghamton that ran up to Syracuse and Utica, New York, in upstate New York. And there was a lot of ag business on that and a little bit of industry in Syracuse and Utica that attracted rail traffic. And they ran that also out of Binghamton. So this train, sometimes when the stack train day wasn't running, they would ferry revenue general freight between New Jersey and Binghamton, where it would then be put on locals that ran up and down to upstate New York cities. And I think that traffic pattern still exists today. There's still, if you go to Storaka Viaduct today, there are no Norfolk Southern, even though it's owned by Norfolk Southern, there are no Norfolk Southern road freights on it. It's strictly a Susquehanna operation where they lease from Norfolk and Southern the rights to run trains between New Jersey and upstate New York. And it's not stack traffic anymore. It's just revenue they've generated on their own. So that's been a real success story of a satellite railroad that's started, that was wobbly at the time of Conrail's inception and now is a standalone, prosperous regional carrier. So that's something to really be proud of. Another railroad that was one of my favorites was at the time it was called the Octa Railroad, and it ran along the Brandywine River over a portion of the Reading, Wilmington, and Northern line. The Wilmington and Northern connected the city of Wilmington to the city of Reading, Pennsylvania, and it ran through all this bucolic Chester County, Pennsylvania horse farm kind of scenery. Is right through the heart of Andrew Wyeth country, and everything around there looks like a Wyeth painting. And all the stations, which many of which still exist, are these fieldstone stations, like the one you see at Pocopson in the upper left picture. This area was originally full of estates owned by the DuPont families, and each DuPont estate had its own personal passenger station, just like, and they were all like the size and stature of that one you see there in Pocopson. And so they were probably staffed by railroad employees, even though the only passengers that would ever show up to run it were people from the DuPont family who, by sheer coincidence, were major stockholders of the Reading at the time. And I'm sure that had nothing to do with it. But anyway, that area is largely unchanged. It's now, the railroad is now the East Penn Railroad, and they run every day except Sundays. They're based in Pocopson, and they run up to Coatesville, Pennsylvania, to a major steel plant, which is one of their customers that processes scrap steel, turns it into modern steel, and down all the way at the other end of the line, they tie into the CSX, which is their major interchange partner right on the outskirts of Wilmington, Delaware. Very scenic line. And then we also have the Livonia, Avon, and Lakeville, which was took over a bunch of otherwise going to be abandoned by Conrail Lackawanna branch lines in rural upstate New York, mostly dealing with agricultural business. The LA&L is still in existence. Engines still wear that same paint scheme. They're part of a larger short line family known as the Western New York and Pennsylvania, which is corporately based, I think, in Olean, New York. And they operate a series of other similar cast off branch lines under that name. And so the LA and L is still around. And then we had the Black River and Western, which was running into Flemington, New Jersey on a former Lehigh Valley branch line that was a cast off. And they, like most short lines, just went to the used beater locomotive market and picked up an interesting locomotive or two to rail fans and just something they could afford to run, including this RS3, which interestingly enough survives today. It's part of Delaware Lackawanna's fleet in Scranton, Pennsylvania. It's now painted back to its original Central of New Jersey colors and operates regularly in freight service there. And with that, I think I've probably tortured you guys enough. And if there are questions, I'm happy to answer any of them if I can.
Yeah, Brandon, real quick before we go to questions, thank you again for taking the time out every Wednesday evening to do the presentation. You know, for me personally, I like the Pennsylvania area. You know, so learning a little bit every time about, you know, Conrail and, you know, these, like you said, these side railroads that were, you know, in that area of the country, you know, it's fun for me to watch. So again, round of applause for you to do this presentation. So we're gonna kind of limit questions just since it's a little late. So we'll do 5 to maybe 10 minutes. So if there's any questions, feel free to ask away. All right, I'm not getting any questions.
Hey, Brandon,
Yeah.
is the main central that I saw on here 238 still in existence anywhere?
There are some GP38 still in existence. Those particular ones, I don't think survived, at least not with those numbers. But
Okay, so
as you probably know, the Conway Scenic currently owns the 2 former Main Central GP38s that are operational. And there's a few others that I don't know the numbers or anything, but a couple of them went to a place called Brookfield Locomotive and were remanufactured into these hybrid half electric, half diesel engines. And so those ones are on Main Central frames and probably even still have cabs and things, but all the innards are different and they're obviously not Main Central identity anymore. So there's, I'd say, about 4 or 5 of them physically around, even though there's only 2 that are kind of still really GP38s.
We got one question that came in over the comments. So Peter Ward said, "Very good presentation, thank you. What's your favorite place to railfan in Maine?" He said
In Maine,
he said he hung around the Lewiston Yard in the 60s and 70s and around Bangor.
oh, I have a number of them, but and it changes over time currently because the operations are so kind of fluid between all these new railroads. But I like the anytime someone wants to go up to the CP on Moosehead area, I'm a sucker for going up there. The scenery is great, and you know the trains are a little bit predictable, and they seem to be on an upswing with traffic patterns and things. So, the former CP trackage, I think, is currently my favorite. I'm becoming more and more interested in how CSX is playing the game on the Main Central, and I'm starting. You know, sometimes their traffic patterns are pretty predictable on certain lines, and lines that used to be under Guilford were almost impossible to railfan because if it ran at all, it ran unpredictably and usually at night.
Yeah.
And so like the what we used to call the Eastern Sub, which is now the Mattawamkeag line, now runs pretty regularly and often during the day. And it's not a bunch of rusty old track with trains loping along at 5 miles an hour. The trains actually move along, and that's kind of fun to see, is just a railroad doing what a railroad does well.
Yep.
And so I like going up there too.
Sweet. All right. Any last minute questions before we log off for tonight? I'm not seeing any. So Brandon, thank you again. Again, we appreciate you taking the time out of your Wednesday to give us this presentation. I know you've done. I don't know if you've done more than one in the past, but I know you've done one that I remember watching. So you'll probably be hearing from either myself or Eric Grover here in the near future to hopefully get you set up to do another presentation within the next year or two.
Sure.
We'd always be glad to have you back. Your presentations have been good. So, but on that note, thank you all for tuning in tonight, and we will see you guys next month.
Thank you.